Slow recovery. Why Pope Francis must stay in the hospital a few more days. Infrastructure bill. How Democrats are trying to work around Republicans. Gun violence. President Joe Biden reveals his agenda to fight crime. And relying on faith. People in Haiti seek God's help in the midst of the country's crisis. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, July 12th, 2021. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. Pope Francis will remain in the hospital for a few more days to complete his recovery. The news was confirmed this morning from the Vatican. The Holy Father has completed the course of his post-surgical operation treatment. Yesterday, from the balcony of his 10th floor hospital window, the Pope shared his profound gratitude to all during his Angelus address, stressing how health care for all is an essential service. EWTN Newsroom correspondent Colm Flynn joins us now. Colm, great to see you. So what is the Vatican saying today about the Holy Father?
Good evening, Tracy. Well, the Vatican announced that Pope Francis will spend an extra few days in hospital to completely recover from his surgery last weekend. Now, the Pope is currently in the Gemelli Hospital here in Rome, and the hospital have said that he completed his course of his post-surgical operation treatment, and the extra days he is spending at the hospital are to, quote, best optimize the medical and rehabilitation therapy. So nothing to be alarmed about, purely precautionary, and a case of them being extra thorough.
And Colm, how is the Pope doing right now? Can you update us on his condition?
Well, the Vatican press office, they have been providing a daily briefing on the Pope's health, and they pointed out that the Pope is doing well. Last Friday, they said that he was gradually resuming work, he was walking, and his blood tests were, quote, satisfactory. In fact, he met with patients of nearby wards over the weekend in the hospital and their families as well.
And we understand the Holy Father is actually still working. He prayed the Angelus from the hospital yesterday. What more can you tell us about that?
That's right, Tracy. Pope Francis went in for surgery, of course, last Sunday. That was a week ago, just hours after he said the traditional Sunday Angelus in St. Peter's Square. So many were wondering a week on if he would be well enough and strong enough to deliver the Sunday Angelus yesterday. Well, he was, but he did it not from St. Peter's Basilica. He did it from the 10th floor of the hospital. From the open window, he expressed his joy at being able to keep the weekly Sunday Angelus appointment, and he noted his profound gratitude to everyone, saying, quote, I have deeply felt your closeness and the support of your prayers. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. He went on to talk about the importance of healthcare being accessible to all, regardless of economic pressures or difficulties. He thanked the doctors and the nurses who looked after him, and he asked everybody to pray for those who are sick.
That is wonderful. You know, and on a different note, I understand Pope Francis is a big soccer fan. Something pretty big went on over the weekend. Tell us about that.
That's right, Tracy. A big weekend for all sports fans, including Pope Francis, because it was a huge win for his home country of Argentina, for his adopted home country of Italy as well. And the Pope shared his joy and excitement over the victory of the Argentine and Italian national football teams. He offered his thoughts on the meaning and values of sports and on the capacity in sporting activity to be able to accept any result, even defeat. Of course, Italy beat England 4-3 on penalties, winning the Euro Championship, and Argentina beat Brazil across the pond 1-0 to win the Copa America. And Tracy, let me tell you, here in Rome, many Italians, including many in this office, stayed up extra late last night to celebrate Italy's win. It was a fantastic night. It really was a sight to see. So back to you.
Well, that is wonderful. Congratulations to all. And Colm, thank you so much for your time today. Colm Flynn, EWTN Newsroom correspondent.
Thank you, Tracy.
A papal visit to Scotland in November remains on the Vatican calendar as Pope Francis is expected to attend this year's UN Climate Change Conference. Ahead of the Glasgow meeting, Pope Francis plans to join a related faith and science seminar in Rome. On Capitol Hill, the House is still on recess for another week, but in the Senate, the race is on. Lawmakers are in for a weeks-long summer sprint with some of their biggest priorities hanging in the balance. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Oh, that's right, Tracy. You know, the Democratic-led Senate has some work ahead of them. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has two priorities that he wants to do, an infrastructure bill and a voting rights bill. You may recall that that voting rights bill passed the House last month and since then has been in the Senate graveyard. In a Dear Colleague letter late last week, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer put lawmakers on notice that they could be working long nights, weekends, and potentially have a shorter August recess. The Democrat from New York states, quote, "My intention for this work period is for the Senate to consider both the bipartisan infrastructure legislation and a budget resolution with reconciliation instructions, which is the first step for passing legislation through the reconciliation process," similar to what he said on the Senate floor last month.
The bottom line is both tracks need to make progress concurrently. This is about building a foundation for the United States to remain the world economic leader in the 21st century.
You may recall a bipartisan group of more than 20 senators are still working to turn their bipartisan infrastructure framework into passable legislation. The bill would spend $1.2 trillion over 8 years on true infrastructure, like highways, bridges, waterways, and broadband. Senate GOP leader Mitch McConnell hasn't said if he will support the bipartisan plan, saying in Kentucky last week that he believes it, quote, needs to be credibly paid for. Meanwhile, Democrats are under growing pressure to find a way to come up with a voting rights bill. House Democrats were able to put up 50 votes last month to advance the For the People Act to the Senate. This week, a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee is expected to hold a hearing on the act. Senator Schumer stated in his letter that he reserves the right as Majority Leader to bring the For the People Act back up for a vote. But Senate Republicans have spoken out against it for months.
It is all about consolidating power in Washington, D.C. This is a power grab for D.C. politicians and bureaucrats.
And pro-life lawmakers up here on Capitol Hill are upset with President Biden's budget proposal because he stripped out the Hyde Amendment and other provisions that prevent your taxpayers from paying for abortions. The Susan B. Anthony list, the pro-life group, says they put out a statement. They say Democrats are, quote, doubling down on extremism to appease the increasingly radical basis. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
President Joe Biden is under pressure to help cities nationwide plagued by shootings and murders. Today, the president invited several law enforcement leaders to the White House. But will it be enough to silence the streets? White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, good evening to you. President Biden met with big city police chiefs and mayors as they grapple with the scourge of gun violence. For example, in Chicago this past weekend, a 31-year-old man was shot 64 times as he walked out of the Cook County jail there. The suspects took off.
President Joe Biden on the out-of-control violence in some American cities.
Well, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We know there are some things that work.
The never-ending question, how to stop it.
We recognize that we have to come together to fulfill the first responsibility of a democracy, that's to keep each other safe.
The White House says part of its overall strategy is to go after what it calls rogue firearms dealers, use money from the American Rescue Plan to put more police officers on the streets, and help young people who are often either the victim or perpetrator of violent crimes find jobs.
Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters today,
and all of these measures, our hope is that they will lead to a reduction in gun violence and crime in these cities, of course.
But the Heritage Foundation is not sold on President Biden's efforts to bring peace to the streets, writing, President Biden is coming face to face with the disastrous effects of 2020's widespread anti-police protests, policies, and rhetoric, all of which he supported. And former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned, when it comes to our Second Amendment, the Democrats are headed down a dangerous path. We must stop them. Regarding gun violence, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has stated the church recognizes that recourse to self-defense is legitimate for one's own safety. In today's world, however, weapons that are increasingly capable of inflicting great suffering in a short period of time are simply too accessible.
President Biden also said that the Justice Department has created 5 new task forces to crack down on illegal gun trafficking. And he also said, in his words, he wants young people to pick up a paycheck instead of a pistol. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, political protests. People in Cuba call for a better government response. And after their president was assassinated, people in Haiti seek God's help. Coronavirus misery and economic hardship sparked street protests in Havana and across Cuba yesterday. To chants of liberty, enough, and unite, the demonstration grew to a few thousand and lasted more than 2 hours. There were altercations between protesters and police. Cuba's new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, did make a masked appearance on the street. He later spoke on national TV, blaming the protest on anti-Cuban social media provocation. And joining us now is Carlos Ponce, Senior Fellow and Director of the Latin American Programs at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Dr. Ponce, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We have a lot to discuss, including some really disturbing allegations of government mistreatment of a Catholic priest. But first, I'd like to talk about the demonstrations. Are you at all surprised? And why do you think this is happening now? What is fueling it?
Well, it has been 62 years of repression, persecution, lack of food, lack of medicine, 62 years. And people wonder if after Fidel Castro, they were expecting some change in Cuba. Nothing happened. After Raul Castro stepped down, nothing happened. And recently, the Cuban regime also has been persecuting artists, becoming persecuting also citizens, and not only political dissidents. They have been persecuting anyone who just raised the voice in Cuba. So people are getting tired of the regime, and finally, enough is enough. There's nothing coordinating this demonstration. This is people who's getting tired of not having food, not having liberty, and they are chanting Patria Vida. So what they are chanting is they want the freedom for Cuba.
Yeah, and what do you think is going to happen next? And also, what do you think this signals to the U.S. and other countries?
Well, it's going to continue. My concern is going to be is that something like Belarus could happen. There's more violence. The criminal regime will persecute everyone. We bring more violent gangs to the street to repress people, persecute, killing. 60 people already disappeared. 5 people killed by the regime so far. Even a good friend of mine, a Catholic priest, Castor Alvarez, he's in jail after beating by the regime, after torture by the regime. Also, seminarian Rafael Cruz also in jail because of the regime. So they don't care if you are a Catholic priest, if you are a pastor, or you are an artist, you're going to be forced to persecution and repression by the regime. The regime will continue that. The problem is the response from the international community. As we saw, the message from the White House was weak, calling for some kind of dialogue. This is a time for strong voices, global voices against this terrible regime, this tyranny that has been there for 62 years.
Yeah, and I was going to say to you, speaking of the U.S., do you think the Biden administration, do you think it should get involved in some way? And do you think they actually will get involved? What would you like to see happen?
Well, the problem is that you have different message internally in the administration. There are some people in the administration that wants to wait and see until the regime reacts, given an opportunity for some kind of dialogue. There are some people inside the administration who want something else from happening. So that confusion internally in the administration creates a problem for the Cuban people. They don't have the time and the luxury to wait until they figure out what a force internal in the administration will have the major strength internal. So far, the response, there's a representative from the State Department that just blame COVID-19 and know the suffering from the Cuban people. I believe this is the time for the administration to open the voice and call for a global response to Cuba, not only U.S., individual sanctions, not global, individual sanctions for the members of the military and the people that is persecuting the Cubans, global approaches to Cuba, putting more pressure into regime, cutting down this regime. That is too much. 62 years is too much. Calling the Canadian government to stop supporting the regime, calling the Spanish government to stop supporting the regime, trying to stop any weapon that goes from Venezuela or any gunmen from Venezuela from going to Cuba. That's the kind of reaction that we need from the administration.
Well, Dr. Ponce, we probably have maybe 20 seconds or so left, but quickly, final thoughts, and also, what would you like the American people and people of other countries to know?
Well, I believe that people need to know that also it's about religious freedom. It's a persecution against Christians. It's a persecution against Catholics. It's a persecution for anyone who can have a faith stronger that make this person fight against the regime. And I believe that this is a time also for the Pope to do something about the regime in Cuba and not continue supporting this regime.
Well, Dr. Ponce, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Carlos Ponce, Senior Fellow and Director of Latin American Programs at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Peace and prayer were the messages at Mass in Port-au-Prince yesterday as Haiti grieves its slain President Jovenel Moïse. Some there, 36, are suspected in a purported kidnapping plot which turned lethal. The injured First Lady tweeted today that she thanks God for being alive. Up next, back in the spotlight, how former President Donald Trump is making headlines. And bound for space, one billionaire sees his lifelong dream come true. At the Diocese of La Crosse, Wisconsin, a politically outspoken priest may no longer exercise public ministry. Bishop William Callahan's decree immediately removed Father James Altman as pastor of St. James the Less Parish and added several restrictions. Father Altman is seeking an appeal. Over the weekend, he offered a prayer at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Dallas, also known as CPAC. Our former President Donald Trump also spoke at CPAC, and he weighed in on the state of the country under the Biden administration.
Joe Biden has brought our country to the brink of ruin. Right here in Texas, we are the epicenter of a border and migration crisis unlike anything anyone has ever seen before in the history of our country.
The three-day conference normally serves as an audition for GOP presidential contenders. In the straw poll taken among attendees, former President Trump won over a field of a dozen candidates with 70% of the delegates' votes. And joining us now is Christopher Bedford, senior editor at the Federalist. Chris, welcome back. Great to see you as always. So what stood out to you about the former president's appearance?
What stood out is more of a verification of what we've suspected, and it's hard to keep track of sometimes in Washington, D.C. and in the Northeast, is that President Trump, former President Trump, is still extremely, extremely popular in huge amounts of the country. Today I was down in Florida, and yesterday I was down in Florida, and recently I've been in a number of other states outside of the D.C. Beltway and outside of the Northeast, where it's extremely common to see Donald Trump flags still hanging from people's trucks or from their homes, Donald Trump signs still up. There's certainly a lot of devotion to him, and that showed where any straw poll that didn't have that had Donald Trump in it, he won absolutely handily. Now in Washington, D.C. and some of the other areas, some of the political types are more wary of former President Trump, and it's certainly a long road to go before the next Republican primary is decided. But right now, it's still his to lose if he decides to run.
Yeah, I want to go back to that straw poll. Former President Trump won one, but there was also another one that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis came out on top. Talk to us about that.
It's wild how popular he is in his home state and around the country. Ron DeSantis has largely become a symbol of conservative pushback to the Democratic regime right now, the Democratic government, both Congress and the executive. Out here in Washington, D.C., a lot of the Republicans are basically able to stall and slow down some of the Biden administration's agenda and sometimes make a stand here or there, but they can't really accomplish anything. So if you want to look at what conservative governance is and what Republicans are trying to accomplish, Florida is leading the country in a way that they've never really done before. Traditionally, Texas or some of the other states have been leaders in the GOP. But since the COVID lockdown, since the rise of Governor Ron DeSantis, by a thin margin of victory, his win was certainly not guaranteed without Trump's endorsement when he ran. Under his leadership and under COVID restrictions and their fight against them, he's become basically the gold star for what Republicans are trying to accomplish and what they will be running on in this next election.
Oh, Chris, I want to talk about something else right now. I know that you've been monitoring hate crimes against Catholics. Can you update us on that, and especially some of the Catholic and Christian churches being targeted in Canada? What can you tell us about that?
It's extremely troubling. Over the last 5, 6, 7 years, it's become very common for people who are even high levels of power to attack the Catholic Church, attack believers, attack the Knights of Columbus, attack local priests even, not just bishops and popes, as has often been easier to do than parish priests. That has turned into violence across the United States, from Boston to California to Texas, all the way up to Ohio, violence in churches against the United States, in Europe, and excruciating vandalism, extremely sacrilegious vandalism. Now, going even beyond that, over the last few weeks, in a complete mass hysteria covered up and pushed over by smears from newspapers and politicians, there has been an organized and vicious terror campaign against Catholic churches and other Christian churches, especially those that are on indigenous lands and First Nations lands. This is not simply spray paint and not even simply decapitating statues of Christ, as horrible as that is. It's burning down over century-old churches that were built by hands, often by the believers, and it's all in response to things that we knew long before, which is that there was a troubled history with the government that did involve the Catholic Church, that Pope Benedict has apologized for when he was Pope, that the Christians who are responsible, who were involved, have apologized for, that the government has apologized for. It's being completely overblown, and I've got an article coming out about it tomorrow morning at the Federalist, all on this subject, and how not only do we know about these crimes that people are being accused of, but most of them weren't even crimes. There were no children being murdered at these education centers in Canada. There was simply a lot of poverty and a lot of crowding, and just like in a lot of the world, there was a lot of disease.
Oh, Chris, we'll definitely be looking for that article for sure. Anything else you're following? And in particular, I'd like to get your take on what is happening in Cuba right now with those protests.
Well, it's certainly not what the State Department said yesterday when they said that this was just a response to rising COVID cases, which made almost no sense at all. And I'm glad to see the White House starting to come down against that, for the protests and stand with freedom here. The people in Cuba that are waving American flags are going to face a huge onslaught, both from left-wing press and also especially from their repressive government. And the best thing that we can do for those people is to pray for them.
Oh, Chris, thank you so much for your time. We'll always appreciate it. Christopher Bedford, senior editor at the Federalist. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And finally tonight, celebrating a space flight milestone. Yesterday, entrepreneur Richard Branson jubilantly reached his childhood dream, gazing down on Earth, flying his own ship, proclaiming a bold challenge.
To the next generation of dreamers, if we can do this, just imagine what you can do.
Branson reached an altitude of 53 miles, evoking comparisons with Alan Shepard's pioneering American flight 60 years ago. Amazing. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.